So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the conference. So, today I'm going to talk about second language writing development. Just a brief introduction. So, my name is Attila Wind. I obtained my PhD degree this year from Lancaster University, and today I'm going to talk about part of my PhD thesis. So let's start. There's the overview. So obviously I would like to introduce the topic and then talk about complex dynamic systems theory. Then we're going to have a look at second language writing development, and the other segment of my basic study is self-evaluation, and then a little bit about the methodology and the results, and discussing the results. And obviously I would like to give you some pedagogical implications for you, because most of you probably are teachers of English, okay? I have been teaching English for almost 15 years, so I can say that I have a little bit of experience. And what I found in my classroom is that L2 writing or second language writing is a little bit of neglected area of skills. However, we can say that, as the ICD pointed out, that it is one of the most important skills. Also, Barco said that it is one of the most difficult skills to acquire. And what is interesting also is that in the IELTS language exam, as you can see, writing is one of the, these are the mean scores for the writing results, and it is the lowest among the 4 skills. Also, so it's for around the word. The same goes for Hungarian learners, as you can see. So writing is only 6.3. It suggests that there is a problem with writing also in the classroom, language classroom in Hungary. So that's why I became interested in second language writing development. Okay? What could be the possible reasons for this, let's say, difficulties or problems in writing? I think we could list infinitely, but I found 4 factors which may be possibly, you can see them as possible reasons. One of them is the lack of exposure to comparable and parallel text. Basically, it means that when you teach writing, if teachers teach writing at all, you may show some translations of different texts or compare the students' writing with written, so with samples written by native speakers also. Okay, the other is the lack of explicit instruction on academic writing in L1. So couldn't necessarily find references, but based on experience, there's not much teaching about academic writing in L1. The other thing is the insufficient amount of time spent learning to write. So I'm teaching from New English 5 series, and I recently just went through the course book, and I found that only the 10th of the tasks are related to writing. So basically, students do not necessarily receive instruction on writing. And the other major factor, which is going to be the most important for today, is that the inefficient use of self-regulated processes. So self-regulation, I mean, I don't know whether you have heard about self-regulation, basically means that you regulate your behavior, and it's an interdisciplinary construct, but obviously I focused on the learning perspective. So basically students, and especially in writing, need these strategies to regulate while they are planning, while they are composing the text. Okay, so let's have a look at the going through this self-evaluation, which is one segment of self-regulation. Okay? Andrade, in a recent article, just pointed out that self-evaluation, or as she calls self-assessment, is basically a feedback, and the most important purpose of a feedback is to promote learning and improvements in performance. Okay? Also, Andrade basically distinguishes between two types of assessment. One of them is the formative forms of self-assessment, the other is the summative, and she points out that formative is I would say, the most important, because that's basically related to knowledge and skill development. Formative basically means that you constantly ask your students to self-evaluate their writing in this case. Summative is just kind of end score, basically then we can say that the teaching or the learning period finished, then you ask them to evaluate their product. Okay? And there are two important studies which basically prove that self-assessment or self-evaluation promotes or facilitates writing development. One of them is Graham 2015 and the other is Villányi 2012. Okay? But there are other studies which basically show that self-assessment promotes learning, not just in writing but in other aspects. Okay? We can say that in the past 10 years in SLA research, a new, we can say, framework or theory appeared. It is called complex dynamic systems theory, which was, we can say, that first mentioned by Larson Freeman in 1997. However, it took many years that researchers realized that it can give you, I would say, newer insights into studying language. Okay? There are a lot of features, but I just highlighted 3 features which you can say that they are relevant to my study. One of them is variability. Basically, this means that performance is not a constant thing and changes over time. So also, for example, you ask your students to take a test, you ask at another time, maybe the results will be different even if the test is the same. So there is a variability in performance, also variability in language learning. The other is nonlinearity. So as you can see in the trajectories, that a learning trajectory is not a linear process. So you can say that, for example, when I learn vocabulary, for example, on Monday I learn 10 words, on Tuesday I also learn 10 words, but obviously there is attrition, so sometimes you forget some words, but you may learn more words, so there is a kind of it's a non-linear process. You also realize that sometimes you forget certain words, and it's also part of acquisition, or I would say development, because acquisition rather refers to a kind of end process. Okay? The other most important tenet of CDST is coevolution or coadaptation. Basically, it means that if we think about the language as it consists of different systems, so for example, lexical system, syntactic system, or also self-interacting over time. So when we are investigating these systems, we cannot really investigate them separately. So we need to consider the other systems as well. Okay? So what could be the relevance to SLA? I would say that there are many aspects which would be relevant to second language acquisition. But I would say that if we are interested in how students develop, we need to take consideration that these are the main features of CDST. Okay. So let's have a look at the study I conducted, which basically was my PhD study. So the research context was an EAP course in Hungary, and initially I followed 6 participants. It is a longitudinal study, so which is very difficult because sometimes you lose participants, so it's a stressful process. But finally, I focused on one person. Her name is Dawn, with a pseudonym. Okay. The data I collected, so I collected 23 argumentative essays over 9-month period. Among these 23 argumentative essays, these were basically IELTS type argumentative essays. And 7 of them, I mean, the writing prompt was created by me, so I just wanted to control some of these effects. Okay, and the most important part was also that I interviewed these participants. So we can say that in a month, so there was a short interview, which basically focused on their self-regulatory processes. So self-observation, so what they saw during their writing process. I also asked them to evaluate themselves, so self-assessment, and also I asked about their goals. Okay. Then I coded the interviews, so these were the 3 processes. Okay. Also, the essays that I collected, obviously I needed to transcribe because some of them were handwritten, and as you know, there are certain, at the moment, computational tools such as cometrics, so I just put them in and generated some indices. So I also looked at average word length because it says that you can say that at an advanced level, students tend to learn longer words or use longer words basically, which means that more academic words are obviously longer. Okay? There's also a measure of textual lexical diversity, which is a kind of variability measure. So, and obviously if it goes up, it means that students do not use the same word all the time, but they tend to use different words. Okay? Also, I checked the frequency and also latent semantic analysis, which is basically about cohesion, and academic vocabulary list. So whether these students acquired the academic words in English. Okay. Also, I checked syntax. There was the finite verb ratio, which means that if there is a finite verb in a sentence, and if there are more words, it means that maybe there's a kind of, we can say that there's a development because students use more words in that sentence. Okay, subordination, a standard measure, coordination, and more importantly, as it is basically pointed out, that at academic level or at an advanced level, students use more phrasal, complex noun phrases. So I checked phrasal coordination. Basically, it means that there are 2 nouns and they are sort of coordinated with an and or phrasal complexity. So, okay, phrasal coordination, phrasal complexity were computed in the syntax computational tools. And lastly, I also checked the accuracy, so whether these students could write without error over time. Okay, so the data analysis, which is a kind of innovative to some extent in SLA, I can say that there is over the past years, so they introduced some techniques to use in a time series analysis. Time series means basically that since I collected 23 samples over time, so I needed to use different methodology to look at development. Okay, so one of them was min-max graph, and then in order to check variability, I also resampled the data and I used some statistical measures to check whether there was a development. Okay, the other one was coevolution, and maybe as you can see here, so there's a graph about my self-evaluation. So since I just collected 7 basically interviews, I needed to interpolate my data. So that's why I created, you can say, more data points. Okay, so that's basically spline interpolation. I also smoothed the data because, as you can see, there is a high degree of variability. For example, here, as you can see, that's the original data. And with kind of smoothing, I was able to see that how, for example, in this case, average word length, academic vocabulary develops. Okay, so there was an increase. Okay, going back to. Okay, and I also employed some statistical calculations in order to see how the two constructs interact. Okay. So let's have a look at the results. So the very little results suggested that the academic vocabulary list, so highlighted in yellow, so there was a developmental peak, as Verspool calls it. Basically, it means that, as you can see, that the percentage of in the texts was basically between 0 and 3%, between data points 1 and 12, and there was a high peak around data point 50, and then we can see that in the remaining part from between data point 18 and 23, it was much higher. So basically it says, according to variability analysis, that there was a development. Okay. Also self-regulation, so I coded the interview data, and the red shows that students employed more self-evaluation over time. So that's why I focused self-evaluation and sort of neglected goal setting and self-observation. Okay. This is what I asked in the interviews, so very simple questions because these were upper intermediate advanced students. So are you happy with the level of vocabulary? Then they said, no, I'm not satisfied because I feel I repeat myself too much. So when they use some cognitive processes, so I calculated them or coded them as self-evaluation processes. Okay? And more importantly, I divided into self-evaluation on vocabulary and the other on syntactic processing. Okay, and the correlation suggested, interestingly, or maybe not interestingly, that there was a high correlation. So also the residuals, the smooth data correlated really highly with the academic vocabulary list. So as you can see, also the trajectories are similar. So it's even non-professional person can see that there is a high correspondence between these trajectories. Also, as you can see, the smooth trajectories are highly similar. Okay. So you can say that the lexical system showed the biggest improvement over time, and lexical and self-regulated systems co-evolved, so basically co-adapted over time. Okay, that was the. So what can you do with your students in the classroom? That's an interesting thing, and it took some time also for me to digest my results and to come up with a kind of pedagogical implication. So you can ask your students basically to write reflective journals after each writing, or you can ask them to sort of evaluate themselves based on a rubric as used in normal tests, in TELS, for example. Okay. Here's an example. So for example, in Nita and Baba studies, you can ask your students to evaluate their language, basically, or the content, what they wrote about, also about the composition processes. But what is important is that you need to teach these processes. You need to teach and basically, so teach these processes and give these charts to them after writing task. And I think that should be a kind of helpful strategy. Okay. So basically, that was the presentation. I don't know if you have some questions at the end of the presentation, or you're interested in dynamic systems. I hope it wasn't boring, but dynamic system is a very difficult area. So thank you for coming, and I hope you're going to enjoy the rest of the day and absolutely. Yes?
I do have a question. It was very interesting. Could you talk a little bit about how you designed the writing tasks and how you linked them up? What was the idea behind them? Because I'm sort of grasped that there was a connection.
Between the writing prompts.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, it was a kind of combination of writing prompts that I created. I created 7 writing prompts, and all were related to language learning. So, for example, to what extent do you agree that I don't know, non-native teachers or native teachers are better than non-native teachers? So some sort of argumentative essays. And the others were taken from an IELTS preparatory course book, and they were all related to different topics. Obviously, we can say that writing on work, writing on sport, obviously produces different results because there's different topics and students maybe are more interested in other topics. But this combination provided I would say, a kind of a more reliable source of information. I don't know whether I explained it.
Yeah. Sure. Now I understand why you looked at the academic works throughout, because that you would expect to stay constantly improve and be able to be traced and compared.
Yes, but it was not really surprising that the academic words increased.
Are these words from Coxhead's 3,000 plus?
Initially I used that one, but there is another one, a newer one, but I can't really say the name of the author, but it was probably a couple of years ago, appeared in Applied Linguistics, and it's a newer one, more reliable, probably.
Thank you.
Your student who wrote all these essays, right? So it was just a graduate school student, or it was university?
The university student, yes. So
and
they wrote,
that student was just doing it to improve his English or take some exam, or you were just teaching him or her how to get these goals?
yeah, basically she attended an EAP course, so an academic purposes course, and I didn't teach the course, so that was another teacher who taught it, and I just asked them to write these essays for me, the 7 essays for me, and the other essays were written for the course.
You just made an analysis of this?
Yes,
Okay.
yeah.
Okay, I have a question. So, are you planning to teach writing in a different way if you teach English?
Yes.
Courses? And what did you change, or what do you want to change for the future?
I would like to basically implement these, let's say, results or what I. So basically, I think teaching writing is an important thing, and we should teach as teachers because it is a neglected area. And I think if you basically draw their attention.
You're going to ask them to do more self-evaluation?
Yeah, I think it's an important thing. So basically, the problem is that I think students don't get enough feedback on their writing. So sometimes you just give a score, or also at the exams. And sometimes you may write that you should write different, you use different tenses here. But I think if they learn to self-evaluate or self-assess their essays, basically because they write usually at home, or they write not in the classroom, so teachers don't necessarily monitor their writing. So that's why it's very important for them to be able to self-evaluate. Okay, thank you for coming.
Sorry, I have another question. So at the beginning of the presentation, you mentioned peer evaluation, but you haven't really said much about that. Is that not the same effect, or is that also efficient for developing this self-assessment process among students?
Very good question. I mean, I didn't check peer evaluation, so that wasn't part. But it was just, so there are results, or we can say that there are different studies which check that one. I think it was in the beginning. Yeah, I think that was Villányi and Tanjit. I don't know how to pronounce it. Yeah, they checked peer assessment, and they also found that that's also contributed to improvement. I didn't check the research.
Thank you.